Welcome to Environmental Law course, dear learner and viewer. Today we are going to discuss the Indian constitutional framework of environment and federal structure. Dear learner and viewer, you can vividly recall that we have been discussing the constitution and environmental framework, and during the last two lectures we had a very fruitful discussion on the global constitutional spring and how the very idea of the environment protection and sustainable development has received by the two-third majority of the countries to incorporate some provision on environment and development in their constitution. We have different categories of the constitution across the globe. The constitution of the countries which have recognized some provisions for environment protection and sustainable development. We have the another set of the countries which have recognized rights to healthy environment as one of the constitutional right is the another and the second categories of the country, and there are third category of the country which have recognized right to healthy environment to be enjoyed by the person, citizen, non-citizen, and as well as it has recognized rights of the nature, taking biotic and abiotic entities right in their constitution. And we have taken a very broader and holistic view of the comparative constitutionalism in relation to environment and sustainable development. And we have also underlined that the discourse and the diametrics which are being permeated into the increasing sense and surge for the constitutionalization of environment, most notably the Constitution of Ecuador, the Constitution of Chile, the Constitution of South Africa. And then we also try to refer some of the finest aspect of the Indian Constitution. Now, the present lecture, dear learner and viewer, we are going to devote the present lecture and as well as lectures to come to see the Indian constitutional framework of environment. And looking at the Indian constitutional framework of the environment, we start from the federal structure and the federal framework of India because, and the reason to start without having a perusal of the provisions relating to environment which has been inserted into India's constitution in 1976. The reason which stands alone is the reason which can be said that the Rio Summit or the Rio Declaration and the 40 diversified themes known as Agenda 21 have emphasized on one central point is think globally and act locally. Taking this theme of think globally and act locally, we have to see at the federal framework and the federal structure, the how the federal structure which has been envisioned into Indian constitution have reacted and responded to the question of the environment. With this, we will be looking at how environment protection in India evolved from local responsibility to national, centrally regulated legal framework. We will see that how the shift to centralization brought some policy conflict between center and state, impacting state autonomy and community aspiration. We'll be looking at the Indian federalism per se to examine to what extent the Indian federalism accommodates environmental legislation in its quasi-federal approach or a kind of a federal approach known as federalism with strong centralizing tendencies, or we will see that how the union government have a precedence and dominance in legislative policy and implementation in relation to environment. We'll be looking the comparative federalism of the US federal structure and try to see that how the federal environmental regulation is neither rooted to what in India called as the quasi-federal state or the state with a strong centralizing tendency, but to a cooperative federalism, and pointed to this effect can be said to be the Clean Air Act, where we find a different kind of an approach fostering environment. Do we have really in the Indian federal design, as it has been practiced in US in matters of environment, be that in the Government of India Act 1935, be that the Constitution of India 1950, right from the Article 24 to 262, most notably these six articles which we find have a great bearing on the major environmental laws in this country. We'll be looking at that the federal agenda and distribution of power among the center, state, as well as the local self bodies like municipal corporations and Panchayati Raj institution, to see that how the interstate, the union, concurrent, and the state list have approach to the question of the environment, how we find in union, concurrent, and state list vis-a-vis the list for municipal corporations and Panchayati Raj institutions. We try to see that the centripetal tendencies of environmental law of the federal distribution, as it has been rightly be said to represent a strong central bias in matters of resource development and water management, which bears enough testimony from Interstate Water Dispute Act 1956 and River Board Act 1956. And then we will try to see that how the central laws and delegated regulations in matters of Water Act, in matters of environmental lawmaking of forest, wildlife, approach to the question of preservance of biodiversity with equity, public participation, and protection of indigenous rights. We'll be also looking at the central lawmaking processes, delegated legislation, grassroots environmental federalism, and then having broadly outlined what we can say to the discussion of Indian constitutional framework of the environment in matters of federal structure and the basic precepts of federalism, we will try to see that how there can be a relation between federalism and environmental law in matters of its historical connectivity, in matters of its shift, in matters of national planning, and encouraging state and local government to have some kind of environmental stewardship. We'll be looking at mostly the central regulatory framework and national standards and delegations. We will also be taking some discussion on the center-state conflict because of excessive centralization of environmental policies and encroaching on the state autonomy. We'll be analyzing that how cooperative federalism in matters of India's environmental governance reflect the aspirations and how the Indian Constitution's quasi-federal structure have accommodated the question of environment across all entries of the 7th schedule to the Constitution, be that union list, be that a state list, be that concurrent list. We will also try to see that not only the quasi-federal structure, that whatever centripetal tendencies which are being rigorously enforced into environmental governance have its own repercussions in Indian federal design and environment. What remains to be said about Indian federalism? To be very succinct and to put in nutshell, as Ambedkar has said, that Indian federalism is unitary in character in emergency and it is federal in normalcy. But do we really have the sense and ethos and the precepts of federalism visible in days of normalcy, or the unitary character of India's federalism can only be discernible in emergency, or the unitary character of Indian federalism is visible even in emergency and normalcy both? Then if we see very critically all these three aspects, we are reminded of K.C. Weir, which says that India as a quasi-federal, or Sir Ivor Jennings saying having a strong centralizing tendency, or the Administrative Commission has said that India has a strong and strict sense, deep centralism. The relationship between the state and the center, which happens to be legislative, which happens to be administrative, which happens to be financial, all these see this relationship in Indian federal design have been very intelligently maneuvered to suit the goals of environment protection and sustainable development. That remains to be our focus, which we will be taking note of these three articles in matters of only legislative relationship. And we see that how the parliament's approach to have the residual power under the union list has a dominance in concurrent matters. How Article 246, which pertains to list 1, that is union list in 7th schedule, where the center has a massive role to play, how despite its massive role to play under Article 246 in relation to the union list, Article 248 again sidetrack Parliament's power to exclusive power in matters of both concurrent list and a state list, and how Article 249, which is exclusive to the state list in the national interest, also been usurped by the parliament to legislate the matters pertaining to the environmental matters pertaining to the state list in national interest. How Article 252 of the Indian Constitution confers power to Parliament to legislate for two or more state consent and adoption of such legislation by another state, meaning thereby that how the state happens to abdicate its power to center to legislate upon the items of lawmaking which remain in the exclusive domain of the state list in order to bring uniformity by a resolution by the state and consent of the state. How Article 253, which is an article in relation to Article 51 of the Indian Constitution, which talks about fostering respect for international law, and what has been mentioned in Article 51 and entry 10 of the Union list in relation to Pacta Sunt Servanda. Through Article 53, the center has been empowered to pass law to give effect to international agreement. And how Article 260 lastly try to adjudicate the dispute, the water dispute, interstate dispute on rivers and river valleys. So, a cursory glance of the very idea to see the Indian federal design is congenial and suitable to environment or not, start from its doctrinaire prescriptions of quasi-federal, strong centralizing tendencies, centripetal tendencies, which is exhibited from Article 246 to 262 of the Indian Constitution. Then we see that India's federalism, which consists of union list 97 items, state list 66 items, concurrent list 47 items. To what extent these three lists gives priority to the question of environment and environmental lawmaking. In this respect, what we see that let us peruse all three lists and try to pull out federal distribution between the state and center under 7th schedule, union list, state list and concurrent list, and find what are the environmental items which has been mentioned. In that respect, we see that in the Union list we have atomic energy, we have mineral resources, we have shipping, navigation on inland waterways, we have maritime shipping, navigation regulations, we have a subject known as mineral resources, oil resources, petroleum, liquid and substances, we have maritime shipping and navigation regulations. Then we find, on the contrary, in the state list, the issue of the public health and sanitation, which is a direct bearing, as we have seen in case of Municipal Council Ratlam versus Verdichan, in our discussion on the common law remedies for environment protection and law of public nuisance and right to sanitation, right to health, which has been envisaged under Articles 47 of the Indian Constitution, how the state list of sanitation, public health, burial, cremations, agriculture protection, plant diseases, livestock, animal quarantine, cattle, protection of animal, and other practices have been listed in the state list. Then we find in the concurrent list cruelty to animal, the forest, then wild birds, food and its adulteration, protection of all these subjects has been mentioned in the, and this is just a tip of the iceberg. We see that it also mentioned the forest, and then we see that in the India's federal structure we find centripetal tendencies, and to this end we will see the River Board Act and Interstate Water Dispute Act, and then Water Prevention and Pollution Act, which has been passed under 249, 252, because water was essentially a subject of lawmaking which is there in the state list. But in order to bring uniformity, the center has passed this law. Then we see that either it is Article 252, from where the Water Act was generated, or we see Article 262, from where the River Board Act and Interstate Water Dispute Act was passed. Then we see it is dominantly centripetal and there is a lack of centrifugal behavior in matters of environment, water, interstate river management, and the river pollution. Therefore, what we feel in the Indian constitutional framework of the federalism and its place of the environment, then we find that most of the water dispute are far from being satisfactory, as they have not been resolved amicably in matters of equitable water sharing, simply because, again, we will refer to that water is a metaphor of power. So most of the state most of the rivers, and especially this is important because India is a riverine country where major and minor rivers are flowing and gushing, and the state which has been endowed with the river, then they use it as a power, and that power sometime result into some discrimination to the neighboring and riparian state, as it has been visible in case of Kaveri, in case of Almaty Dam disputes. Then we see that in matters of water resource management, the over centralization of the authority, lack of mutual trust, weak institutional framework has given rise to some precipitating crisis into the water management, alongside some kind of the indifferent attitudes of the State Pollution Control Board in resolving the water dispute. Thus, out of the discussion on India's federalism, we reach to the point that environmental lawmaking by the center and state in reference to 7th schedule, in reference to union list, in reference to concurrent list, in reference to the state list, provided under the Constitution of India 1950, have resulted into the enactment of forest and wildlife. Although these were the state subject, but it was moved to concurrent list in 1976 by 42nd constitutional amendment, where the state and center both can share the legislative domain. And then the Wildlife Protection and the Forest Conservation Act are indicator to a kind of a mutuality which try to synergize the centripetal and as well as the centrifugal away from the center and towards the center. So this 1976 constitutional amendment is important, bringing forest and wildlife from state list to concurrent list and creating a sense out of these two legislation from centripetal to centrifugal attitude of the federalism in matters of environmental lawmaking. Therefore, barring these two, we see major environmental laws are either passed by giving effect to Article 252 of the Indian Constitution, Article 253 of the Indian Constitution. So, be that the Environment Protection Act, be that the Air Act, be that the National Green Tribunal Act, and likewise all important sectors of the environmental lawmaking are neither passed by the union list categorizations of the subjects, nor by the concurrent list, nor by the state list, nor by the exclusive domain of the parliament of Article 246 and 248, not by abdicating the powers except the Water Prevention and Control of Pollution Act, which the state have requested the center in order to bring uniformity, abdicated its power to the center to pass a law. And that law have taken almost more than a decade. It started in 1952. The entire passage and development of the Water Prevention and Control of Pollution Act started in 1952, and it was passed in 1974. So the Water Act is a classical example of 249 and 252, And then we see that invariably, but the bulk of the environmental legislations have been passed to taking resort to Article 253. Somewhere it is mentioned in order to give effect to the Stockholm Declaration. Some it has been mentioned Rio Conference. And then, as a matter of the Pacta Sunt Servanda and Article 51, most of the environmental laws are passed. These are the laws which bears the testimony that how it has been resorted under Article 253. Then we see that these laws have a different kind of a mechanism, and all these laws which has been passed by giving effect to Article 253, fostering respect to international law, now will be taking into account a critical look of the Indian federal structure and saying that how the federalism in India, which is not like the federalism of United States as it has been envisaged under Article 1, India, that is Bharat, shall be the union of the state, but does not have the same kind of the federal values and ethos as it has been witnessed in the US federalism or the Canadian federalism or the list, union list, state list, and concurrent list, which has been borrowed from Australian constitution and inserted into 7th schedule. We find that there are a large number of environmental entries and entities which has been mentioned in the 7th schedule, though there always remains a kind of a feeling, and that feeling always disturbs because the word environment per se has not been mentioned in union list, concurrent list, state list. Nonetheless, it mentioned wildlife, it mentioned forests, it mentioned animals, it mentioned wild animals, it mentioned water, it mentioned atomic energy, it mentioned agriculture, it mentioned the catena of the subject which have bearing on the environment, but we see that the entire environmental lawmaking in the Indian federal framework discerns not cooperative federalism, not centripetal tendencies, but it represents typically, as the constitutional jurist Sir Ivor Jennings and K.C. Ware and Indian Administrative Reforms Committee have opined that it is quasi-federal, having a strong centralizing tendencies. It mostly happens to be unitary than federal. And what we try to conclude that despite existence of the constitutional amendment of 1976, India mostly indulged into the environmental lawmaking by giving effect to Article 253 and fostering respect to international law. Thus, we see that there is a need to relook and revisit the Indian federal framework provided under the Indian Constitution 1950 and try to see very carefully and dispassionately that whatever entries have been mentioned in the 7th schedule to the Constitution of India can have a better sense of cooperative federalism and centrifugal tendencies, because environment is a subject which requires grassroots federalism, which requires cooperative federalism, which requires centrifugal federalism, than that of unitary federalism, a strong centralizing tendency, or quasi federalism, so that the needs and aspiration of the state, the environment, the natural resources, the community can be better served into India's constitutional framework of federalism vis-a-vis the environmental protection. With this, I thank and I wish you a happy learning.